The words hung in the air between us, sharp and brittle, like shards of glass. You couldn't live without me. He'd said it with a small, condescending smile, as if he were stating a simple, irrefutable fact. The kind of fact you might tell a child. I remember the way the afternoon sun, usually so warm and comforting, felt harsh and accusatory on my skin as it streamed through the kitchen window. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the years of quiet neglect that had settled over my life. We were in our impeccably neat kitchen, the one he'd insisted on decorating with a muted palette of grays and whites, a sterile reflection of his own predictable existence. He was holding his usual evening glass of whiskey, the ice clinking a rhythmic, dismissive counterpoint to my sudden, suffocating realization. My exhale felt ragged, a tiny gasp in the vast silence that followed. He didn't look concerned, merely amused. My life, up until that moment, had been a carefully curated landscape of his preferences. The house, the car, the furniture, even the friends I was allowed to see. He liked control, a steady, unwavering grip on every aspect of our shared existence. It wasn't overt, not usually. It was in the way he'd suggest I wear a certain dress for a party, subtly implying my own choices were somehow inadequate. It was in the way he'd advise me on my career path, steering me away from anything that might require too much independence or, heaven forbid, success that rivaled his own. My ambitions had been a delicate seedling, carefully pruned by his constant, well-meaning advice until they barely resembled anything I'd once dreamed of. He'd framed it all as love, as protection, as his duty as the provider. And I, in my naive earnestness, had absorbed it all, believing that this carefully constructed dependency was the very essence of marital bliss. There were so many little moments, little stones dropped into the well of my patience, that I'd almost forgotten the sound of the water. Like the time I'd excitedly told him about a promotion opportunity that had come up at my small marketing firm. It was a significant step, one that would have required more travel and a more assertive role. His reaction wasn't joy, but a thinly veiled anxiety. "Are you sure that's wise, darling?" he'd asked, his brow furrowed with practiced concern. "It sounds rather demanding. You'll be exhausted. And what about our weekends? We always have dinner with the Millers on Saturdays." He'd presented it as a logical consequence, a trade-off I should be willing to make for the sake of our comfortable routine. I'd quietly declined the promotion, the vibrant spark of ambition dimming under the weight of his perceived practicality. Then there was the incident with my parents. My father had been ill for some time, and I'd been trying to arrange for a more specialized caregiver to come in while he recovered from a surgery. I'd found a wonderful agency, highly recommended, but their rates were on the higher side. When I brought it up, mentioning that I was considering using some of my modest savings, he'd waved it away. "Don't worry your pretty head about it," he'd said, his tone of casual dismissal still echoing. "I'll handle it. We have more than enough." And he had. He'd paid for the caregiver, of course. But later, at dinner, he'd casually mentioned to my mother, in my presence, "It's a shame she doesn't seem to grasp the value of money. I worry about her if anything were to happen to me." He'd said it with a sigh, as if burdened by my supposed financial illiteracy, further solidifying his image as the wise, capable protector, and me as the childlike dependent. The sting wasn't just in the lie, but in the deliberate humiliation, the public display of my perceived helplessness. The day he uttered those fateful words, a slow, icy dread began to creep into my veins. It wasn't anger that surfaced first, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. The years of silent capitulation, of swallowing my own voice to appease his need for control, had culminated in this pronouncement of my inherent weakness. He saw me as a fixture, something he'd acquired and therefore owned, a beautiful, fragile ornament dependent on his continued presence for its very existence. The irony of it all was a bitter pill. He saw dependence as love, and I had mistaken his control for security. The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. I watched him, his face a mask of casual superiority, the ice in his glass melting, mirroring the slow dissolution of my manufactured reality. I didn't argue, didn't plead. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of someone who had finally, irrevocably, seen the truth. The truth that his pronouncement, meant to assert his indispensability, had instead illuminated the starkest lie of our marriage. He believed me incapable, and in doing so, had inadvertently handed me the keys to my own lib. Ration. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The house was still cloaked in the pre-dawn gray, the silence undisturbed. I moved with a quiet purpose, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I'd experienced the day before. The feeling of being trapped, of being utterly beholden, had been a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. Now, that weight was beginning to lift. I showered, dressed not in the pastel, demure clothes he preferred, but in a crisp, dark suit I hadn't worn in years, a forgotten relic of a more assertive past. My reflection in the mirror was unfamiliar, a woman with a glint of steel in her eyes. My first stop was the office of a solicitor I'd discreetly researched weeks ago, a firm known for handling complex financial settlements. I sat across from Ms. Albright, a woman whose calm competence radiated from her like a quiet warmth. I laid out the facts, meticulously, calmly, presenting the evidence of his control, the subtle manipulations, the financial decisions made solely by him, often without my full understanding. I had, over the past few years, started keeping discreet records, copies of bank statements I'd managed to access, notes on conversations where financial decisions were made, even photocopies of emails he'd sent that indicated his unilateral control over shared assets. It wasn't grand theft, but a quiet documentation of a lifetime of being sidelined. Ms. Albright listened intently, her pen moving across her notepad with the same precise rhythm I aimed for in my own life. Back at the house, I found him still asleep, his face soft and unguarded in repose. It was a moment of vulnerability I'd rarely witnessed, and for a fleeting second, a pang of something akin to sadness pricked at me. But it was quickly overridden by the resolve that had solidified within me. I went to the study, a room that was technically mine, but which he had always treated as an extension of his own domain, filled with his financial journals and investment portfolios. I opened the secure filing cabinet, the one he assumed only he had the key to. Over the years, I had observed his habits, noted his routine. I had even, on occasion, managed to make a wax impression of the key when he'd carelessly left it on his desk. It was a small act of rebellion, a clandestine preparation for a future I hadn't yet dared to imagine. Inside, I found them, the original deeds to the properties he'd acquired before our marriage, the meticulously documented shares in his company, the offshore accounts he'd so carefully hidden. He'd always presented our joint finances as a unified whole, a testament to his generosity. But I knew, and now I had proof, that much of it was his alone, acquired through his own enterprise, and that my contribution, beyond my role as homemaker and silent supporter, was minimal in his eyes. I carefully extracted the relevant documents, the ones that proved his sole ownership of assets he'd always implied were ours. The next few days were a blur of quiet activity. I arranged for a separate bank account to be opened, transferring the contents of a joint savings account that had been established with my inheritance from my own parents, an inheritance he'd always treated as a trivial sum. I paid off my small outstanding debts. I consulted with a divorce lawyer who, thankfully, understood the concept of equitable division even when one party had systematically hidden assets. I didn't engage in shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. My revenge was in the meticulous unraveling of his carefully constructed narrative of control. The moment of reckoning arrived a week later. It was a Tuesday evening, the usual time for our quiet dinner. He was holding his whiskey, a satisfied smirk already playing on his lips, anticipating another evening of my placid agreement. I walked into the dining room, not with a meal, but with a folder. I placed it on the table between us, the silence stretching taut. "I've been reviewing our financial situation," I began, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor he'd grown accustomed to hearing when I spoke of anything remotely serious. He raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering slightly. "And," he prompted, his tone laced with impatience. "And," I continued, my gaze unwavering, "I've discovered that many of the assets you've always presented as ours are, in fact, solely yours." The properties you acquired before our marriage, the majority of your company shares, the funds in those certain offshore accounts. I slid a few key documents across the table, copies of the deeds, the stock certificates, the account statements. His eyes scanned them, then flicked back to my face. The smugness drained away, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a dawning comprehension. His hand, holding the whiskey glass, stilled. The ice stopped clinking. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight, unfamiliar. "This is a formal notification," I said, my voice cool and measured. I have consulted with legal counsel and am initiating divorce proceedings. And that I intend to ensure a fair settlement, based on the reality of our financial standing, not the illusion you've so carefully maintained. His face contorted, a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning panic. The arrogant certainty I had always seen in him crumbled, revealing the insecure man beneath. He stammered, his carefully constructed facade shattering. "You can't, you wouldn't, you don't understand these things." The fallout was, as I'd anticipated, a predictable storm of his making. Frantic texts flooded my phone, followed swiftly by calls from his mother, his sister, even his closest business associates, his flying monkeys as I now understood them to be. They pleaded, they threatened, they attempted to guilt me into submission, all echoing his narrative of my dependence and his victimhood. His mother, in particular, was incandescent with rage, her voice shrill with indignation as she demanded I cease this absurd charade. He himself became a caricature of his former self, a man adrift, unable to comprehend how his carefully woven web had unraveled so completely. His social standing, once so secure, began to fray as whispers of his financial maneuverings and the impending divorce circulated. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility of my agency, to the quiet resilience I had cultivated in the shadow of his dominance. He never recovered. The businesses he'd built on a foundation of perceived invincibility began to falter under the scrutiny of the legal proceedings. His reputation, so carefully guarded, was tarnished. He was no longer the benevolent provider, but a man exposed for his manipulative tendencies and his financial duplicity. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek out his suffering. My satisfaction was in the quiet dismantling of his power, the absolute negation of his dismissive pronouncement. I had, indeed, lived without him. I had built something new, something entirely my own, brick by painstaking brick, while he was still trying to comprehend the crumbling of his empire. The silence that now stretched between us was not the silence of dependency, but the vast, empty silence of his irrelevance.